My mother-in-law slid a folded check across my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in April, already made out for $50,000, telling me it was more than fair for a house she described as falling apart and not worth the trouble of maintaining on my own. 3 weeks later, tucked behind a false panel in the same house's basement wall, I found a safe containing documents that explained exactly why she'd suddenly become so eager to take this specific property off my hands. The house my husband's grandmother left me. My name is Priya Desmukh, and my husband, Arjun, had passed away 18 months before that April evening, following a sudden cardiac event that had taken him far too young, at just 34 years old, leaving me to navigate widowhood alongside raising our 7-year-old daughter, Mira, largely on my own. The house at the center of this story had originally belonged to Arjun's paternal grandmother, Kamala, who had passed away in early 2023, several months before Arjun's own death, leaving the property, a modest but genuinely well-built 4-bedroom house on nearly 2 acres of land outside Louisville, Kentucky, directly to Arjun in her will, a decision Kamala had made deliberately, according to family accounts, based on her particular closeness with Arjun across his adult life. Considerably closer than her relationship with either of Arjun's siblings, or notably, with her own son, Arjun's father, Vikram. Following Arjun's own subsequent, unexpected death just months after Kamala's passing, the property transferred to me, per the terms of Arjun's own will, which had named me as his sole beneficiary for all jointly and individually held property. An arrangement that, I want to be clear, my in-laws had never previously expressed any significant objection to across the 18 months following Arjun's death. The sudden offer. I want to explain the specific, disorienting suddenness with which my in-laws' interest in purchasing this property emerged, because the pattern matters considerably to understanding what I would eventually discover. Vikram and his wife, Sunita, my in-laws, had shown, across the 18 months since Arjun's death, only occasional general interest in the Kamala property, visiting a handful of times to help me with certain maintenance tasks, and on one occasion, discussing whether I might eventually consider selling given the practical challenges of maintaining a property that size as a single parent. This general, low-key interest shifted dramatically in April 2024, when Sunita arrived at my house unannounced, presenting the $50,000 check I've already described, along with an unusually insistent, urgent case for why I should accept this offer promptly. I know this might seem sudden, Sunita told me during that initial conversation, but Vikram and I have been discussing it, and we really think, for your own sake and Mira's, that letting go of this property now makes considerable sense. It's a lot of house and land for you to maintain alone, and honestly, given some of the structural issues Vikram noticed during his last visit, we're a little worried the actual market value might be considerably lower than you're imagining if you were to try selling it independently. I want to be honest that this offer, while genuinely surprising in its suddenness, did not immediately strike me as suspicious. Sunita's stated reasoning carried surface-level plausibility, and I had, in fact, occasionally found myself genuinely overwhelmed by the practical demands of maintaining a large property alone, while also working full-time as a pediatric nurse and raising Mira without Arjun's support. Seeking an independent appraisal. I want to explain the specific decision that ultimately led to my discovering the full truth behind this offer, because it reflected a degree of caution I might not have exercised absent one particular detail that gave me pause. Despite Sunita's insistent framing, I decided, before accepting or rejecting the $50,000 offer, to obtain an independent professional appraisal of the property. A decision motivated less by active suspicion at that point and more by simple, prudent practice regarding a decision of this financial significance. I contacted a local, independent appraiser, Marcus Webb, who had no prior connection to my in-laws or their real estate contacts, specifically to ensure an unbiased assessment. Marcus's appraisal, completed roughly 2 weeks after my initial conversation with Sunita, produced a figure that immediately, unmistakably contradicted the picture my in-laws had painted. He valued the property, in its current condition, at $312,000, over 6 times the amount Sunita had offered. "I want to be direct with you," Marcus told me, upon delivering this appraisal. "This is a genuinely well-maintained, structurally sound property on a substantial, desirable piece of land. I don't see any indication of the kind of significant structural problems that would justify pricing this anywhere close to $50,000. If anything, given recent development interest in this specific area outside Louisville, I'd actually recommend you consider whether the property might be worth even more than my current appraisal reflects, depending on how certain pending zoning and development discussions in the broader area eventually resolve." What Marcus's comment prompted me to investigate. I want to walk through the specific research I undertook following Marcus's comment about pending zoning and development discussions, because this detail ultimately connected directly to what I would discover in the hidden safe. I contacted the Jefferson County Planning and Zoning Office directly, inquiring about any pending development or zoning discussions relevant to the specific area where Kamala's property was located. What I learned through this inquiry revealed a significant piece of context Sunita's urgent sales pitch had conspicuously never mentioned. A major highway expansion and commercial development project, currently in advanced planning stages, was slated to considerably increase the value and development potential of properties in exactly this specific area, with formal approval and public announcement anticipated within the following 6 to 8 months. This information, combined with Marcus's independent appraisal, produced a mounting, uncomfortable suspicion that my in-laws' sudden interest in purchasing this property for a fraction of its actual value was considerably more calculated than their stated concern for my practical well-being had suggested. Finding the safe. I want to describe the specific circumstances of discovering the hidden safe, because the timing, occurring just days after I'd begun independently investigating the property's actual value and the pending development context, carried its own significant weight. I had been undertaking some basement organization that same week, part of an ongoing project to more fully sort through Kamala's remaining belongings that had stayed in the house following her death, a task I'd been gradually working through across the preceding 18 months, but had never fully completed. While moving a large, heavy shelving unit along the basement's north wall, I noticed a section of wall paneling that appeared subtly different from the surrounding material, a detail I might easily have overlooked entirely had I not been paying particularly close attention given my growing suspicion about the property's significance. Behind this panel, I found a small, embedded wall safe, clearly professionally installed rather than any kind of improvised hiding spot, requiring a combination I did not initially possess. I want to describe the specific process of eventually gaining access. After some searching through Kamala's remaining personal papers, I located a small, handwritten note tucked within an old recipe box, listing a 6-digit number alongside the notation, for A, when he needs it. A note that, given Kamala's well-documented particular closeness with Arjun, I correctly guessed referred to the safe's combination. What the safe contained. I want to detail, carefully, exactly what I found once I successfully opened this safe, because its contents fundamentally reorganized my understanding of both the property's significance and my in-law's recent, urgent interest in acquiring it. The safe contained several significant documents. First, a formal letter from a regional development firm, dated approximately 8 months before Kamala's death, indicating preliminary interest in acquiring a portion of her property, specifically in connection with the same highway expansion project I'd already learned about through my own independent research. A letter that made unmistakably clear Kamala herself had been aware, well before her death, of this property's significant, growing development value. Second, a personal letter from Kamala herself, dated just weeks before her death, addressed specifically to Arjun, which I want to share portions of, given its direct relevance to understanding both Kamala's intentions and, significantly, her own concerns regarding Vikram and Sunita's potential future conduct. "My dear Arjun," the letter began, I want you to understand something about this property that I haven't fully explained, even to you directly, though I suspect you may already sense some of what I'm about to say. I've learned, through my own inquiries this past year, that this land carries considerably more value than most people in the family currently understand, connected to development plans the county hasn't yet formally announced. I've chosen to leave this property directly to you, rather than dividing it more broadly among the family, in part because I trust your judgment and integrity considerably more than I trust some others' motivations, should they come to understand this property's true, growing value. I want you to know this clearly, in writing, in case anyone ever attempts to convince you, or whoever eventually holds this property after you, that it's worth considerably less than its actual value. Understanding my in-laws' actual motivation, I want to explain, based on the fuller picture that eventually emerged, how Vikram and Sunita had apparently learned about this same development information, and why they'd moved so urgently to attempt acquiring the property from me at a fraction of its actual worth. Through subsequent conversation with Marcus, my appraiser, and some additional research, I learned that Vikram maintained a professional connection with someone working within the regional planning department, a longtime friend from his own career in municipal engineering, who had apparently provided Vikram with informal, early awareness of the pending highway expansion and development plans before their official public announcement. This early, informal awareness, combined with Vikram's own knowledge that Kamala had originally intended this property specifically for Arjun rather than more broadly distributed among the family, appeared to have motivated a calculated decision. Acquire the property from me, the current owner, before the development plans became publicly known, and the property's value correspondingly, dramatically increased, all while I remained entirely unaware of this pending development context. Confronting Sunita and Vikram, I want to detail the confrontation that followed this discovery, because the specific dynamics of this conversation revealed considerable insight into both my in-laws' actual motivations and their reaction once confronted with clear, documented evidence of what they'd apparently attempted. I invited Vikram and Sunita to my house specifically for this conversation, laying out, methodically, the independent appraisal, the county planning office's information regarding the pending development, and most significantly, both Kamala's letter to Arjun and the development firm's earlier letter of interest found within the safe. Sunita's initial reaction moved quickly toward defensive minimization. "We genuinely believed we were offering you a fair deal," she said, "given the practical challenges you've described facing as a single parent managing this property. We weren't trying to take advantage of anything." "Sunita," I said, "you offered me $50,000 for a property independently appraised at $312,000, with development plans in progress that could reasonably increase that value even further within the next year. I don't think that's a fair deal offered in good faith. I think it's a deliberate attempt to acquire this property before I understood its actual worth, using information Vikram had access to through his professional connections that neither of you ever mentioned to me." Vikram, notably, offered less resistance to this characterization than Sunita, his own response carrying a more direct, if still uncomfortable, acknowledgement. "I did learn about the development plans through my friend at the planning department," he admitted. "I'm not going to pretend that information didn't factor into our timing. I think some part of me also still carries real resentment that my mother left this property directly to Arjun rather than dividing it more broadly among the family. And I let that resentment shape a decision I'm not proud of, if I'm honest with myself." Kamala's foresight. I want to reflect on the specific, remarkable foresight Kamala had demonstrated in structuring both her original bequest and, notably, the protective letter and documentation she'd left specifically anticipating exactly this kind of situation. "I think," I told Vikram, during that same difficult conversation, "your mother understood something about this family's dynamics that she never directly discussed with the rest of us, but that she clearly anticipated carefully enough to leave specific documentation protecting whoever eventually held this property, precisely because she worried someone might attempt exactly what you and Sunita just attempted." This realization carried its own significant weight for me. Understanding that Kamala, in her final months, had apparently recognized specific risks within her own family dynamic, clearly enough to take deliberate, careful steps to protect Arjun, and eventually me, from exactly this kind of calculated attempt to undervalue and acquire the property before its true worth became apparent. What I decided to do. I want to explain the specific decision I ultimately reached regarding both the property itself and my relationship with Vikram and Sunita going forward, since this situation required navigating both a practical financial decision and a genuinely complicated family relationship. I declined the $50,000 offer, unsurprisingly retaining ownership of the property, and working with Marcus and a real estate attorney, began exploring my actual options given the property's genuine, substantial value and the pending development context. Ultimately deciding, after careful consideration, to retain the property for the time being rather than pursuing an immediate sale. Given the likelihood that its value would continue increasing considerably once the highway expansion project received formal public approval. I want to be honest about the complicated decision I faced regarding my ongoing relationship with Vikram and Sunita, given that they remained, after all, Mira's grandparents, with an ongoing, important role in her life, regardless of the significant breach of trust their attempted property acquisition represented. I established, going forward, considerably more guarded boundaries regarding financial matters specifically, declining, notably, several subsequent suggestions from Sunita regarding various financial help or advice she offered across the following months, while maintaining a more limited, carefully bounded relationship focused specifically on their role in Mira's life rather than broader family financial entanglement. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since I found that hidden safe behind the basement wall panel, and the highway expansion and development project, Kamala's letter, and the development firm's earlier correspondence had both referenced was formally approved by the county, roughly 7 months after my discovery. A public announcement that increased the property's assessed value, according to Marcus's follow-up appraisal, to approximately $480,000. Considerably beyond even his original estimate. I've made the decision, in the time since, to develop a portion of the property myself, working with a small development consultant to explore commercial leasing options for a section of the land directly adjacent to the planned highway expansion. A project that, while still in its early planning stages, represents exactly the kind of opportunity Kamala's careful, protective planning ultimately preserved for me, and eventually for Mira. My relationship with Vikram and Sunita remains genuinely complicated, functional but carefully bounded, built now on a foundation of considerably more caution than existed before this entire situation unfolded. I've made my peace with this more limited, guarded dynamic, understanding that some breaches of trust, even within family, require lasting adjustment rather than simple, complete forgiveness and restoration of previous closeness. I think often about Kamala's specific foresight, a woman who, in her final months, took the deliberate, careful step of documenting her intentions and concerns in writing, hidden behind a wall panel in her own basement, specifically anticipating that someone in her family might eventually attempt exactly what Vikram and Sunita ultimately did attempt. I think about how close that $50,000 check came to succeeding, had I simply trusted Sunita's urgent framing without seeking my own independent appraisal, and about how grateful I remain, even now, for Kamala's quiet, careful protection, extended forward in time specifically to protect a grandson she loved. And eventually, the granddaughter-in-law and great-granddaughter she never had the chance to fully know, but clearly, deliberately chose to protect anyway. At the end,